welcome to the Me and You show. I'm you.
And you're me.
Right.
That's great. Welcome everyone to Science Sunday, November 3rd Sunday of the month in December issue, first Sunday in December. Happy day. These days are just flying by.
Yeah.
Welcome all. Scott Thompson and Mike Winter are here to talk with you about science issues, and we thank the church, Justin up top that's running the AV, and the church that allows us the space and capacity to get together and to stream our thoughts onto you, and the stream of consciousness, I guess, is what we're going to have today.
Excellent.
I really keep grabbing these big issues and get in so deeply that it's hard to get out, actually, sometimes. So this one, we're kind of committing that it's the last one, although I have no real topic set up for early in January. But this one is kind of the purpose. It's the underlying aspect of today's talk is the purpose of consciousness. What is the reason behind consciousness, and is it inherent that it has to be? If there would be another planet, another system somewhere with life on it, would consciousness be an existential and a very important part of it? Would it necessarily be there? Is it necessary that consciousness arises? And so I'm going to start my talk with a little bit of that, maybe a little bit of the underlying emphasis being, how did consciousness come about? Why is it? Is it a mistake? Is it something that's inherently needing to happen in a system where life is? And I don't think I have answers, but I've got some good questions about it. So
you might want to tell people on YouTube they can type in their questions and comments.
Or you might want to.
Yeah, I could do that because I have a microphone.
We're a dual microphone area here.
Yeah, so if you're watching via YouTube live and not after the fact, feel free to type in your questions or comments. And if you are watching after the fact, you can always leave comments later. And Mike and I occasionally go back and look through them. And we'll, in any case, we're glad to hear from you.
Yes, and welcome again to Science Sunday. First, I think we can try to describe a world maybe in which there is no consciousness, and then maybe talk about how it may have come to be. Was consciousness always a part of our world? And And why would that be, or was it deemed or necessary for it to continue? Can life go on for the 4 billion years that it's been on this planet without consciousness? Or is it a necessary and important factor in it, in life? So there's a little bit of philosophy maybe matched with a little psychology and biology to start things off. But why has consciousness evolved? We're here and we know that that we're conscious. We know that we're conscious. We can't prove that anything else is conscious, but we have aspects and ways of measuring it now, and science has spent maybe the last 20 years or so, 30 years probably by now, spending a lot of time really looking into how can we measure and evaluate, come up with theories of consciousness. And so we'll talk about some of that as well too. But why and how has consciousness evolved? If we look at it, these letters are a little bit smaller than I wanted them to be, but I hope you can see them on your screen. 4 billion years of life on Earth. A little bit of review. Bacteria have been the most advanced life form for 3/4 of that time. For 3/4 of the time that life was on Earth, there was nothing more complex than a bacteria. A little mat maybe at the most of individual bacteria living together. Okay. We've talked about this before, and this is something that's kind of an amazing part of life. You know, if humans or all multicellular organisms would depart the planet right now, bacteria and viruses would most likely remain still after that time. So we're not necessary for life on Earth. In fact, like I said, for 3/4 of the time, for 3 billion years, there had been no multicellular animals, which tends to imply no consciousness at all on the surface of the Earth or in the depths of the Earth. So now I start, based on some of those basic presumptions, what consciousness tactics or skills developed in that amount of time? So what occurred that you could define as consciousness? When did it come about? How did it come about? What were the aspects of it, and why did it develop, you may think? And some of those have been studied quite a bit. What made things conscious, and what can you define as being conscious, or who and how, aspects of consciousness or traits or tactics that might have evolved into consciousness. And probably there's some knowledge now that bacteria with certain tendencies, they will move towards heat at times, or move away from heat, move towards light, or move away from light. They seem to be able to sense it and avail themselves of the benefit of it. Is that really consciousness? But it may have been the beginning of consciousness. Even detecting chemicals. When certain chemicals are in water, bacteria can move towards either the more highly concentrated aspects of the chemicals in the water, if they're desirable elements, or move away from them if they're deleterious. So that seems to be some level of a burgeoning consciousness. If you can think of other tactics or skills that you could define as consciousness, that could be you could type that in and send it in to Scott, and we'll call them out too.
Yeah, one of our viewers, Kaiser, has said that exactly that. He actually anticipated your statement by a minute or two, saying that avoid and approach kinds of reflexes, responses, and interactions with the environment are a precursor to consciousness. So.
Yeah. This precursor, these skills, tactics, and obviously you start looking at that, and those are aspects of an organism that can then pass that on to another, to its daughter cells or to its offspring. So those that are more adept at doing that, those that are more accurate in their perceptions and actions, more helpful to them to survive, would pass that knowledge on to their daughter cells. Even at this time, if they were not even really living things, they could be chemical organisms that aren't even really pre-life yet, and not even really replicating in some ways as well too. But,
you know, you say pass the knowledge on to their descendants. It makes me think that that's a different sort of information transfer than reading a book or listening to a teacher, where humans are able to pass knowledge forward from generation to generation. That's a hard-coded sort of knowledge about avoiding certain chemicals or being attracted or repelled by light, etc. That's all. That's a form of knowledge transfer that is not nearly as mutable.
Right. And I'm going to spend quite some time talking about that aspect in a little bit, that information can be passed on in many ways, right? We've talked many times about genetics and DNA and passing on knowledges and capacities for survival in life, but we'll talk more about that in a short while, so very good. Next question. Could it be that anything beyond single cellular organisms are a historical chance? If the Earth went on for 3 billion years with life on it, with nothing developing beyond that, what's to say that it couldn't have gone on further? In what means or by what methods, what finally occurred to cause this to happen? This becomes a philosophical question that can be studied, biologically as well too, but what would actually determine that consciousness or multicellularity, which seems to have to be some level of a precursor to consciousness, how could it be that it's determined and determinate it has to happen? And I think there's been a lot of discussion back and forth, and why would it be that if we'd be able to travel or find something out about some other planet or some other life in some other place, would it necessarily be multicellular? Would it necessarily have the capacities that we think of now? And I don't know that you can definitively prove it one way or another, but we'll talk a little bit more about what would cause multicellularity, and we have in the past. I did a Science Sunday about multicellularity and the occurrence of it. What makes it that multicellularity, did it have to occur, or could it be that we're just, a fluke, an odd arrangement here?
The classic dichotomy between chance and necessity. Some things are bound to happen given similar initial conditions. They're essentially unavoidable, and other things are entirely avoidable and happen only by chance.
Mm-hmm. Good, yeah. So, further, under that assumption that we may have been a fluke, a development in that way, what benefits would multicellularity provide? It would seem like multicellularity would only go on if it provided some benefits, right? So what benefits would multicellularity provide to organisms? And conversely, what demands or costs would it take? Do the benefits outweigh the demands, right? So if you think of some benefits of multicellularity, and some costs of it, you could send them in to Scott, and we'll read them out to you as they come in to us as well, too. But there was a world for 3 billion years that we can be pretty sure that had no consciousness, had life, but no consciousness.
Had reflexes, reflexive behaviors about light and chemicals and whatnot, but not necessarily conscious ones.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Jeremy, I hope I didn't shock somebody with that.
So, benefits that multicellularity would provide would be potentially the capacity of predation. You would have more capacity to hunt down a creature that would be beneficial to you to eat. It provides you with more capacity to solve and work with the struggles of life and so on. The challenges of life, you'd have protection maybe, you'd have capacity to do something about challenges to you. So there are some benefits of multicellularity, but it is an amazing demand on energy costs, the energy it takes to develop all the different structures that bind in multicellularity, that cause you to have an area that's a feeding area, and an area that's a reproduction area, and an area that's a respiration area. All that takes a lot of energy and coordination and is very demanding upon resource gathering for any small organism just developing that. So it had to be at a time, it had to come in a way that the benefits outweighed the costs. And they are significant costs. So kind of as a culmination of these kind of thoughts about consciousness evolving in prehistoric times, animals may be a niche filler who acquired skills that allowed us, speaking of us as animals, to survive. And one of those evolved tactics may be a complex ability called consciousness. As organisms develop capacities to interact with the world, this was the beginning of consciousness. So if we look at one common area that's thought of as an area in which it developed, in which life developed, which multicellularity may have developed, an undersea thermal vent. I don't know, it was very colorful when I picked it up on the computer.
Looks pretty good online.
Online it looks pretty colorful?
Yeah.
A lot of different colors of the organisms that are growing on the rocks that are built up around that thermal vent. And you can see the black clouds spewing heated steam and smoke and spewing out organic chemicals into the environment and all the creatures around there. Typical thermal vent.
Yeah, you may not see on the sea floor there are typically around those vents there are worms and cnidarian, starfish and whatnot that have adapted to that environment.
Right. As I was looking for pictures to show this, I saw a lot with a lot of other creatures around it, sometimes with even people in suits, wetsuits and so on, swimming around it.
Oh, they live down there too, huh?
Yeah, I'm trying to imply this as being something, although it's obviously a picture taken now, but have it at least in your mind established that this was maybe a representation of what a thermal vent 3 billion, 2 billion years ago looked like, right?
Yeah,
so keep that in your mind.
Ocean chemistry might have been a little different, but these hot vents would have been extremely similar with iron sulfides and a lot of other chemicals that are reactive, and hydrogen sulfide reactive enough to drive what we would think of as a metabolic process.
Right, right. So a place with the energy demands satisfied, with the food demands
right, material
necessary for life to develop and flourish. But let's start talking about what might have started living around those places. And we're going to talk about some primordial copying object. I'm not even going to call it an organism yet. They may not have been alive. They may have had the capacity to replicate, but they certainly, at the beginning, didn't have all the capacities that we determine is necessary for life. But they may have had the capacity, and we're assuming that these had the capacity to copy themselves, replicate, and make more if they were in a nurturing, helpful environment. So we're going to talk about primordial copying object A first. We'll call Alice.
Alice,
okay? And so Alice lives close to an active volcanic vent. That's very good. Alice has the heat, energy, nutrients to survive and to thrive and to copy and to make more. So this is a valuable thing for Alice. Very simple copying object, not even able to be called an organism, but able to survive or able to replicate in this area. But Alice's stored information says to her that this precise, this precise location provides resources and habitat suitable for its existence. So this is what Alice has in her capacity to live and thrive in this area, knows that this is an area that she's latched onto that is very important to her for survival, for the capacity to replicate. Okay? And because of that information that she stored which may not even be information that's passed on genetically or anything like that.
Yeah, no genes at this point. It's
Right.
just a replicating molecule in a primordial soup.
Right. And this is shown by a strong chemical bond, a very strong chemical bond between Alice and the rock wall of the volcano. So she's able to survive and be there and live there because she's very strongly attached to this rock that provides her the warmth and the environment that she needs. And because of that, she can copy and pass on her information to the next Alice 2 that comes along, okay? But let's just ask the question now, when this particular volcano or vent becomes dormant, what goes on, what happens to Alice? If you have an idea, a concept of this Alice living in this volcanic vent, when the volcanic vent goes dormant?
When she runs out of soup, that's it, I think.
Okay. There's not much she can do. She's attached to this rock. The rock is there. It's providing good benefit for her. As soon as it doesn't, then she's done for.
Yeah.
Okay.
Poor Alice.
Poor Alice. I don't even want to make an Alice's restaurant joke.
Oh, right, true. Wouldn't be prudent.
So we'll look at, jumping ahead. Primordial copying object B, Betty, who still may not have the capacity, may have no genetic structure, may still be not a living thing, but is able to copy and pass on information to its offspring, right? Again, is close to an active volcanic vent, because that's pretty much the only game in town in this area. And so Betty, like Alice, lives close to an active volcanic vent, but has a little bit of different information stored. Betty's has stored information that similar resources are available in multiple locations. She does not need to know that this is her one and only lifeboat, so to speak, and the one place, and so she is not tied into this specific place, but she's tied into a concept that heat and strength of a rock provides good safety for her.
I don't know, when you say she knows, I take a little issue with that, but
The she or the nose?
the knows,
Right.
the knowledge part. I mean, you can imagine a molecular replicator that finds more than one environment to be suitable, and maybe the ability to persist as a molecule with integrity as it moves from environment to environment. But there's nothing about knowledge entailed in that, I would say.
I would agree. I think I misspoke. And the main reason that I'm implying even that is that there's something different about her chemical structure. And maybe you can come up with what you would say is different about this chemical structure, this second copying object, that's different than Alice's structure. And that is...
Can live without soup for a while.
Yeah. So this is shown by a weaker chemical bond that dissipates without sufficient heat, but it strengthens again whenever another heated rock is chanced upon. So Betty's living on a rock that is a thermal vent and is doing quite well, and maybe Alice is right alongside of her, but the vent dissipates, the vent...
Sputters out.
What?
Sputters out.
Sputters out, right.
Yeah.
Something occurs and it has no, not sufficient heat, and Alice dies off, and the chemical bond that holds Betty to this rock weakens. Betty floats off a little bit and by chance bounces up against another rock with a hot core to it, and the chemical bond strengthens again. And so when we ask the question, when this particular volcano or vent becomes dormant, then Betty has a chance to move on, float on, and become attached to another one that's more active and more beneficial to her. Not anything of consciousness at all, but it's information that is allowing her to survive and move on to another place. Okay? thought I'd just reacquaint us with just another picture of a thermal vent I thought was pretty cool.
Our ancestral home, as it were.
Right, right. I love soup. So you can see the big burgeoning clouds. They kind of almost look like the background there, but there's big clouds of smoke coming out in some places. In other places, look like they're dormant. They're not active.
And that isn't like soot smoke. That's, you know, those are mineral clouds rich in, like I said, hydrogen sulfide, iron sulfide, other sorts of volatile minerals and molecules.
That supply needed chemicals to the organisms around there.
Yeah, as I talked about in one of my talks a couple years ago, particularly the chemical processes associated with these vent smoking volcanoes gives rise to something analogous to proton movement. Protons are positively charged, and if you look at the metabolism of cells today, you might think that cells would use electrons because electrons are lighter weight, and we use electrons for, you know, light bulbs and computers. But the basis of life, the basic charge transfer of life, still depends upon proton transfer, and natural proton transfer, prebiotic, exists demonstrably in environments like this.
Thermal vents like that, yeah. All right, so moving along, now we want to talk about maybe some further evolution in primordial organism C, Claire. So, by this time, I would say that organism Claire would have to be some type of multicellular organism with some of the capacities that we're going to talk about it here. I don't think you can just call it a copying object anymore. But
That's hard to read.
that's hard to read. Claire has a physical structure that reflects the information that heat equals resources, regardless of a location, by chemically sensing and gravitating towards the nearest heat source. Some capacity towards realizing when heat sources and chemical sources are dwindling, and then comprehending that fact to some extent, either chemically or however, and then moving towards another source.
We're able to create all kinds of heat engines, right? From Stirling engines to, you know, two-stroke motors and whatnot. We as a civilization are able to create heat engines, and there's no reason that heat engines couldn't exist at a molecular level in nature and be motile by virtue of heat gradients. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, all of this is very plausible at the nano engineering scale.
Right, right. So Claire is better equipped for acquiring resource needs in a changing world. Claire is also more likely to pass on a distinct survival advantage to her similar offspring. So as these organisms developed, it seems like it can be said that there's some capacity for helping with survival. Mm-hmm. So when this particular volcano or vent becomes dormant, you know Claire can pack her bags and send messages out to all her friends and say goodbye and travel off to another vent and have a good life and maybe and survive and pass on her capacities to her offspring. So, like I say, this probably had to be a multicellular organism, and I also learned as a multicellular organism myself that I shouldn't use light blue on my PowerPoints.
On your green PowerPoints, yeah.
So
It looks fine online, by the way.
good. All right, so that leads me to get to a point of evolutionary success. And we've talked a lot about evolution and evolutionary success in many ways. Scott's talked about it, I've talked about it in different ways. And one area that we've really emphasized it in is the biological evolutionary success. And this kind of gets to what you were talking about a little bit earlier, but this involves things we've talked about in the past: Darwinism and the survival of the fittest, Malthusian economics, things that led Darwin to understand the effect of large populations and the most fit having the capacities to survive. We've talked about DNA, genetics, and mutations quite a bit. All these are things that have occurred in the past, are scientifically happening all the time, And we can see that occurring and how it can be said that simple organisms, through biological evolution, can become more complex. This involves sexual reproduction and introduction of fresh genes into a new individual. All these are very important parts that are in there and that have some role to play in the consciousness discussion. But actually, beyond biological discussion, and I guess it leads to the basic statement that favored offspring will have an evolutionary advantage, while the vast majority will not. The amazing amount of eggs that get put out by a fish or octopi or different creatures that put out amazing amounts of offspring, but only the fittest survive. Or the luckiest. Right. Yeah. So these are all things we've taken for granted, and I want to just use that as a counterpoint to talk about informational evolutionary success.
Ooh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah. So an advantaged organism is more likely to survive and reproduce if it has an ability to analyze and adapt to its environment. So that means it's fit, right? So an advantaged individual is fit, but you can be fit by virtue of your genes and your basic structure.
The programming that you get at birth.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a capacity to survive well by your wits or by your capacity to analyze and process information and so on, which starts to move us toward brain and consciousness and things like that, right, too.
Yeah, I think that when evolution invented the notion of an entity that could learn throughout its lifetime and adapt its behaviors, not necessarily its physiology, but certainly adapt its behaviors throughout its lifetime, that was quite an innovation evolutionarily.
Right, right. That's maybe one of the main thrusts of what we're talking about right now. Information can play a role in the success of a species. If it can process information well, if it's adept at processing the information, if it sees it wisely and applies it well, it's much more likely to survive and pass this on. So this starts to get to the point of why Claire might have been able to, in a primordial soup, survive a little bit better. But also, as time goes by, that can be honed and processed and developed, and that capacity of processing information, not just the genes that you're born with or hatched with or come to you, but also the information that you're able to process. Organisms that develop or evolve more effective information processing capabilities may be favored, at least in certain niches. Not always, but in certain niches they can be much more favored. So that's somewhat of a hypothesis I'm postulating now about it. I think that there's a lot of discussion that can occur about it, but I'm willing to stand that that's a pretty basic thing that I think is something we can base much of the rest of our talk off of.
Fortunately, I don't see anybody here to argue with you, so.
You're here. So, kind of putting together all this talk, consciousness, not to mention multicellularity itself, may be a quirk, a fluke, an unlikely occurrence in a universe that proceeded quite well without either for almost 10 billion years. Most of that was without life at all, but 10 billion years from when the Big Bang occurred to before life is said to have started.
At least here.
On Earth, right. So, in all this time, this consciousness that seems to be potentially, at least you can postulate that it's a benefit, that it can help, although we haven't talked as much about the costs of it too, but there are benefits to it and costs to it as well. In a changing environment, I think information helps much more markedly than in a non-changing environment. If you're on a volcanic vent and it doesn't change for a million years, and you just pass on to your replicating copies the exact things that got you success for your span of time there, you don't really need to have this information and this capacity to interact with the environment. But in a changing environment, which I think the Earth can be said to be demonstrably very adept at change all the time, this can be seen to be a great talent, a great capacity. So, once multicellularity and consciousness arrived, however unlikely that might have happened, the combination became ravenous. I know I got asked after last month's talk about theories of consciousness, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time with it too. We'll kind of use this as a jumping off point to talk more about consciousness, and assuming that consciousness came about in some of the ways we've been talking about, why is it here and what is it? I wanted to discuss these concepts, these theories a little bit. These are two basic ones. There's others that are similar in different ways, but we'll talk about some of these a bit. The global workspace theory is one. It came out and it's been added to in the global neuronal workspace theory, talking about what's going on in the brain. Basically thinking about, because the only place we know for sure that consciousness is evident is in the human brain. So these are basically people that are doing experiments on humans or animals that they think will give us some insight into humans. So in the global workspace theory, it postulates that there's this unconscious fight for dominance going on in your mind all the time between low-level coalitions of neurons. So a few neurons are noticing a funny smell in your kitchen. A few neurons are watching TV. A few neurons are listening to someone speak to you from another room. You're having a few neurons telling you that you might have to get up and go to the bathroom pretty soon. All these different things come about, and they are actually all working there in a level that you're not yet aware of to some extent, until finally one of them breaks through and dominates and takes those concepts, takes that capacity over, so that now this thought, whatever it is, the smell in the kitchen becomes dominant, the need to go to the bathroom becomes dominant, the voice from the other room becomes dominant.
Or a touchdown.
Or a touchdown, right.
Yeah. It's the cacophonous unconscious.
Right.
Yeah.
That's all going on, all being perceived, but yet hasn't come to a level of dominance or preponderance in your mind. Okay.
We have a question perhaps online. What about the evolution of a sensor system to a neural connected system with centralized control?
In regards to Claire, you think, or?
Yeah, I think just in life in general, the evolution of the ability to sense the environment and then connect that to a neural system that can make decisions and whatnot. That's kind of the brain, right? The brain arose, even simple organisms, single-celled organisms, whatnot, might have had some capacity to react to the environment, but the capability to abstract that to generate a model of one's environment and one's behavior vis-a-vis that environment, I think is when we start seeing things like brains and neurons that are dedicated to information processing, not just sensory reaction, heat turning on an engine, but actual processing information, abstracting information about the environment, and then taking action based on it. And we see brains evolve from that. And humans may, depending on your definition of consciousness, humans may or may not be the only conscious being on Earth, but we're certainly, regardless of where you draw the line, we exist in a continuum of entities with brains that have ever more capacity to abstract their environment and change their behaviors.
Right, have more features or less features or so on too. Similar features, the thalamus is involved in many different animals, but the cortex is involved in relatively few. Yeah, and I think I'll get to a demonstration of some kind of concept that ties into that in a little bit too. But basically this, in the global workspace theory, it says that this is a winner-take-all result. Whoever comes out through with it, then the other concepts are pushed aside, is much less there. And I know I said a month ago that the most that you can have in this workspace, in your global workspace, what's there going on is 4 items, no more than 4 items. There's a little bit of talk about that. It's almost hard to comprehend that you can only keep 4 things going, but the capacity of compartmentalizing and chunking things, they call it, to put different things, different concepts together. So I can conceptualize it. I'm at Science Sunday, I'm in a church, I'm with my friend Scott, we've got Justin up front. All that is all kind of chunked together in just one kind of concept right now.
Yeah.
That all you folks are there at home watching me. So that's nice to have all that chunk there. So this is a winner-take-all result. Something comes to the fore, and as it's explained, there's like a spotlight directed onto only one distant portion of a stage, one small portion of a stage, okay? It's as if the lead actor comes out in a play or in a drama, and the spotlight is on that lead actor right now, and everything else is in darkness and not attended to.
We have another question online. Do you know a reference you can point at to get more information, maybe a book you can read about the limits of cognitive chunking?
Yeah, we've got a few. I know Deschain, very famous guy. I'm not sure I have his book with me right now. Stanley Deshaene, or Deshaene. And this book, too, The Ravenous Brain by Daniel Bohr, is very interesting. How the New Science of Consciousness Explains Our Insatiable Search for Meaning. Daniel Bohr, B-O-R.
So he talks about the chunking in that as well?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So this spotlight gets directed onto only a small portion of the stage in our brain, the stage of our mind. And that's pretty interesting. And it's somewhat, now, this is my take of it, it's somewhat of a survival of the fittest idea. It's somewhat of an evolutionary prospect. One of those came out in an evolutionary sense and was able to survive the competition between all the other factions that were attending or trying to get the attention of your brain. So it's an interesting kind of concept. I saw a lot as I was talking about consciousness that kind of talked about the comparison of information, genetic information as compared to intellectual information, and how they both are important and both are needed. I've tried to bring it up in a few different ways here.
You know, this reminds me, I don't want to get off on a tangent with respect to our time limitations, but I've often thought about giving a talk around cognition and morality and moral choice, and the reason that this reminds me of that is because people sometimes say, well, I'm of 2 minds. You know, well, I'm of two minds about whether or not to have another cookie, like to allude to my analogy from last time. And that is literally true, right? You've got different parts of your cognitive identity that have different motivational underpinnings and different goals and different inputs. And so you are of more than 2 minds. You're a multitude of histories and perceptions and desires that are all warring.
Right. So this makes a lot of sense, and one thing that it also does is it allows for some level, and as does the other one we'll talk about in a second, for some level of testable hypotheses. You can test to see how winners take all, if that's always true, or how that happens. You can set up some of these amazing tests that they talk about in each of the books I've been reading about these things, these challenges, these capacities to see how people that are in different states of cognition or awareness react and so on. But there's a lot that can be done, and that's helped people like Christoph Koch and a lot of different people do experiments to try to find out further about consciousness. We talked earlier about Rene Descartes, who talked about, mind and body being separate and so on. There wasn't really testable things that came out of that. But these later theories in the last 20, 30 years have allowed the science of consciousness to really progress. Although it is survival of the fittest, I want to make sure that you know that no neurons die because they didn't win this, this discussion, right? The neurons go on. It's not that they're battling and the neurons are dying. I thought it was valuable to make sure that you realize that if you're thinking, you're not killing your neurons.
So they do not continue, remember Sun Tzu, war is a continuation of politics by other means. So your neurons don't get to the state of actually warring with each other at a physical level.
No, and that's partly where a lot of the discussion is now. You can think about it allegorically as a war, as a battle and survival of the fittest and so on, but it's more a matter of how does something get into attention, and it gets into attention by dominating.
Preeminence, yeah.
Yeah, by preeminence and not killing anything off. Very, very valuable. The information integration theory, and this is, the information and integration are both very important parts of this. Anything that can gather information and can integrate it is considered to have some level, some capacity of consciousness. Then you can start doing, it's a very mathematical model. It really discusses the mechanisms and not the brain itself. It's entirely mathematical. So it's looking at how a system processes information. And if it integrates it, if it coordinates it, if it takes information coming from one area and blends it with information from another to create a subset or a more valuable information, more useful information, the capacity by which it can do it is able to be figured out mathematically. Under this scenario, you can discuss, you can investigate information integration in anything. You can look at a chair and you can say, how well does it integrate the information when someone sits in it and when other things happen, and you say, not very well. It's not integrating that information and processing and coming out with things. Or you can look at a computer and you say, that does integrate information, so it has some level of what in this theory is called consciousness. You can actually even do things in which you can evaluate how well it does that and to what extent. So you can start coming up, because it's mathematical, you can start coming up with scores. And you can give a hypothetical 100 to the most conscious thing around. Maybe a human you'd say is 100, and then you'd start looking at a primate, and you'd say 60 or something like that, and you'd look at an octopus and you'd say 48, and you'd come up with all these different numbers for different things. You can actually evaluate anything that's around and come up with something. And again, it leads toward a lot of testable hypotheses. You can say how many informations, how well connected, how many neurons you're using, or how many information gathering capacities are you using? How varied are they? Are they coming from different sources? Is there a sense of vision? Is there a sense of smell? Is there a sense of taste? Is there a mathematical sense? How connected all this is to each other as well, too. So it's something that can be very well documented. And I was listening to Christoph Kopf, well-known scientific studier, in consciousness, and he talks about how energizing it is to know that this can be done, and how it energizes his work each day to know that he can evaluate and come up with capacities of systems to be conscious. Any system is capable of consciousness, and you can evaluate how well it fits into that, and these hypotheses are then testable.
Sorry, I got a zinger of a question online about the Kardashev scale, which has to do with the level of advancement of energy use of a civilization. So
Okay.
I'll type in.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, these have allowed scientists in the last 30 years to spend a lot more fruitful time developing how to measure consciousness, what it is, how it comes about, and so on. So I thought it was worthwhile looking at them for a second. I don't think it's important to know those names, but I tried to give you some clarity into what they're describing of consciousness. Now, to jump over to an interesting I wanted to develop a statement because I think scientists and studiers of things want to come up with a statement. There was an interesting thing. Feynman lecture on physics in 1961. He had just been involved with the whole Manhattan Project and was well known as maybe the preeminent scientist and preeminent physicist for sure in the nation, maybe in the world. And he was asked, he went to Caltech, and they asked him in 1961, he came in and he was pretty happy to be studying his science and doing his theoretical physics and stuff like that. But he was at Caltech, and I guess they were trying to set themselves apart from the other schools. They asked him to give the introductory physics lectures for a year to incoming undergraduate students. Can you imagine coming in as an 18-year-old into college and you're sitting with the preeminent physics scientist in the world, and he's giving talks. They didn't,
F equals MA and whatnot, yeah, right.
He was not known really particularly for his interest in students, but actually they had become, these lectures had been so antiquated and forgotten about and piecemeal and so on that people weren't expecting much, but he had such capacity to talk and to expound upon things, they decided to give it to him. And the result was actually the most famous student physics lectures and even subsequent textbooks of the time, of all time, really. The Feynman Lectures on Physics. You can get them and read them, and I think they'd be enthralling. Toward the beginning of the very first lecture, Feynman told his packed class of fresh-faced undergraduates, "If, in some cataclysm, all of scientific knowledge were to be destroyed and only one sentence passed on to the next generation of creatures, what statement would contain the most information in the fewest words? I believe it is the atomic hypothesis that all things are made of atoms, little particles that move around in perpetual motion, attracting each other when they are a little distance apart, but repelling upon being squeezed into one another. In that one sentence, you will see there is an enormous amount of information about the world, if just a little imagination and thinking are applied." So, in neuroscience, our atomic equivalent is the neuron. And the one neuroscientific sentence we might want to pass on to that next generation of creatures before we all perish in that cataclysm or the volcano vent goes dead might be something like this. All conscious and unconscious mental processing equates to the electrical activity of vast collections of neurons, information processing brain cells, each of which has a biological version of thousands of input and output wires connected to other neurons, thus allowing each neuron to influence and be influenced by the activity of many others. So a single neuron is essentially a simple node in our biological computational network. It has a multitude of branches surrounding its cell body, each ending in a single wire that receives an input from another connected neuron. The neuron also has a long tail that splits up into many output wires, sometimes counted in the thousands, allowing it to send a signal out to an extensive selection of other neurons. The signal is usually a simple electrical firing at a standard voltage, so it's basically a binary code, on or off, 0 or 1, right?
But how it decides to be a 0 or 1 could be pretty complicated.
Right. There's no firing would be a 0 and firing would be a 1. Almost all other neurons will be working with the same binary language. And there's one more key fact, too. The wires between these neurons usually do not actually touch. They come ever so close. In the brain with hundreds of millions of neurons, the neurons don't touch each other. Instead, when a neuron fires, it actually releases a small amount of a chemical known as a neurotransmitter. You've seen some of these as dopamine, epinephrine, even ATP, adenosine triphosphate. All of those are neurotransmitters.
Among other things.
Right, many, yeah. So it releases this chemical, the neurotransmitter, in the gap between the wires. and it is this chemical signal that the other neuron picks up. There are many different types of such chemicals in the brain. Some are designed to suppress activity, and some are designed to enhance it, right? So that's the brain acting and actuating all the time, and the capacity of the struggle between each of these neurons firing to create interest and influence and so on to win this. So here's some neurotransmitters. This is the end of one neuron right near the beginning of the next neuron. And you can see this flash of light here. I believe this is actually an electro, what do you call it? Electron microscope.
Oh, yeah.
Drawing, a picture. But these are some different neurotransmitters that you may have heard of. Dopamine, epinephrine, oxytocin, adenosine triphosphate, ATP. All those are neurotransmitters that actuate in there. That's the actual function, action in the brain going on. I wanted to go into somewhat of an extended analogy in some of the time I have left. And it's pretty interesting to discuss what's going on. And this was discussed by Bohr in his book. Let me see if I find the page I've got that on. I was just getting to this point and things are starting.
One of our viewers online is talking about the perennial question of free will again, which we brushed on last time. But that's even above the level of just conscious information processing. It's about the volitional latitude of entities to make choices among options. But I doubt that you'll cover that territory again this time.
Right. If you have, we'll talk about it at the end. Let's talk about, let's have like an email analogy to illustrate certain aspects of this neural system. Say I'm a manager in a large company, a Fortune 500 conglomerate. Because we're so cutting edge, we've done away with phones. No need for phones, and rely exclusively on email. As a result of this enlightened decision, I'm constantly deluged with emails. I cannot respond to every single one. So I set up a rule that if and only if I receive more than 100 emails on a particular topic, they all have the same topic of fire, or one, but we'll ignore that for the moment, then I'll pass it on to everyone in my address book. It happens that I receive a lot of emails from one particular person, N. Euron. And I actually find myself writing to him as well. Strangely, he seems to be either active or twiddling his thumbs just when I am. It would therefore make sense to prioritize this closely similar employee's emails above the others. And if I get an email from him, class it as the same as 10 other people's, so that I need fewer emails on a topic if he's one of the senders before I decide to pass it on. So there are some times when I'm feeling rather less productive than others. If we have to work nights, all of us, then I'm going to feel tired and resentful that I'm stuck in this damn office without overtime. At those times, I simply ignore half the emails I receive. So to get me bothered enough to forward some message, I'm going to have to receive it 200 times. And in the middle of the night, everyone else around me is exhausted, despondent, and not exactly glowing with company pride. So everyone becomes quieter at night, and messages tend to die soon after they are sent. On the other hand, in the morning, 20 minutes after our coffee break, we're all buzzing and almost begging for some activity to latch onto. At these times, just 50 messages of the same topic on average will make me forward the information to those around me. And because everyone else is also buzzing, much information flows around the company building at breakneck speed. This analogy illustrates the flexibility in a network of neurons. A neuron will only fire if it receives a certain number of firing outputs from other neurons. But this number can be increased or decreased in the short term depending on what signaling chemicals are used in the gaps between neurons, the tiredness of night versus the caffeine-fueled morning. These chemicals normally flood large collections of neurons indiscriminately. And if two neurons co-fire frequently, this in itself will physically strengthen the connections between the neurons and make it more likely that they will fire together in the future. the regular emails between the narrator, me, and neuron. This leads to the famous neuroscience dictum that neurons that fire together wire together. This is known as Hebb's law, after the pioneer of the computational study of networks of neurons. This easing of information transmission between similarly behaving connected neurons is thought to be the main microscopic mechanism for learning and memory. So, if we learn, say, that the word square responds to the visual input of a square, the neurons that visually represent an object with 4 equal sides at right angles to each other are becoming email friends with those that hear the sound square. They prioritize their emails between each other, or in other words, the visual square population of neurons collectively strengthen their connections with the sound square neurons. If there is any location to this learning, it is in the enhanced sensitivity between these groups of neurons, enabling them to activate each other more easily. So you can imagine here with all the visual squares on the left side of the screen and the auditory, let's say, squares, written word squares on the right side, you would start getting connections of wiring between the two of those, and you'd see a lot of lines of neurons forming between those. Once we understand the word square and we understand the concept square, you know, in 3rd grade or so, then we start using these things repetitively. So, as I mentioned before, I'm a manager in a large company. In point of fact, I happen to work within the security department.
That's you're reading that, right?
Yes.
Okay, you're not a security guy yourself.
Right.
All right.
And it's my job to see that certain, you can think of me as it.
I do, often.
And it's my job to see that certain unwanted types keep well clear of the office building. I'm in security, as you know. Each security executive specializes in a single color. That's yellow if you can't see it. That's my job. I'm keeping yellow. It's because I got sharp eyes. I can pick out that yellow. There's a visual color processing region in the human brain known as V4, with individual neurons firing most strongly for specific colors. My color happens to be a particular shade of yellow. If the junior boys at the back of the building, primary visual cortex, the first cortical station from the eyes, right back here,
Oh, yeah.
if they send me an email, those boys back there, that they've spotted my own lovely shade of yellow on the street, then a few emails from them will get me jumping up and down in my seat. I want to tell everyone I know that my color is around. So I fire off my emails, quick as a flash, with lots of exclamation marks at the end of each sentence. The guy in the cubicle next to me is responsible for the color black. Now, if we both start sending emails madly that our colors are around, then the security guy a level above me down the corridor just needs 1 or 2 emails from us both together for all hell to break loose. You see, if he learns that both black and yellow are on the jackets of those outside, from even a few emails, he sends high priority emails to everyone he knows, and he knows some pretty senior people. Further into the visual stream, for instance, in the inferotemporal cortex, in the temporal lobes, there are neurons that are responsive to combinations of features, or even specific objects by the connections they've made with other neurons. In the neural equivalent of the current example, a wasp has been sighted, and the person is allergic to them. So the yellow and black, yellow and black, yellow and black, the emails send this out, and now the body processes it, the mind processes it, and they detect that those colors and that thing that's going on.
So the smell in the kitchen and the touchdown become irrelevant.
Completely. Right. So, although people rarely listen to me, when the security manager responsible for yellow and black combinations sends emails about what he's detected, they always listen to him. Everyone in the entire building passes on his information without question as soon as they get it. Thanks to a flurry of focused emails on the topic, all the security cameras swing to the site of the spy. Everyone discusses what to do with this enemy and what it might mean, and any guards outside get ready to move the interloper along, if need be. Almost immediately, absolutely, the whole building knows about the spy. with his yellow and black clothes. The guys in my office who are responsible for any colors that aren't yellow or black basically go out for a break, as they know no one is going to be listening to their emails for quite a while. I, for a change, become important, along with the guy sitting next to me who is responsible for black. Our emails are given priority. They are read first and acted on more often than not, as we report on the latest whereabouts of this probable spy to the security guy in the next corridor. So that analogy is basically trying to get you an idea of what's going on in the brain and the attention as the neurons are gaining information, passing it on from where you first see these colors to some part of your brain that's actually able to process these colors and then coordinate the fact that another color that's imbued with that or similar to that or has an impact on that can put that information together, right?
Along with a buzz, perhaps, the sound of a buzz.
Right, yeah. And all that goes on, and then on to the processes of what to do and the decision-making that goes on about it. This has obviously gotten attention, and it's obviously become conscious in your mind. Okay?
In computer science, there's this idea of interrupts, that no matter what's going on, there are certain, essentially hardware interrupts, where, without getting into the technical details, if something activates one of these interrupts, every other bit of processing stops, and it attends to what's happening due to that interrupt.
And the difference, I'd say, is that the brain is more wired in parallel with all these different neurons all connecting in many different ways, while computers work essentially in series, right? So it's a step-by-step progress.
Yeah, even if you have a 16 CPU computer, it can't hold a candle to a million or billion processing unit brain,
Right.
In many regards.
Right, right. Okay, so that was, I think, the analogy I wanted to get to you to see that how the brain can actually coordinate in some way the things that are occurring outside and what goes on inside the brain. So I wanted to close with some take-home thoughts, some of which were talked about today and some of which were talked about at other times. There's so much more to talk about and fascinating stuff. But again, like I said, The Ravenous Brain by Daniel Bohr. And I should have brought the other book, but it's his name is D.E.S. Stanley, D-E-S-H-A-E-N-E, I think.
Yeah, one of our viewers looked it up and typed in the name of it here. I have to scroll back.
Okay.
I'll tell you when I find it.
So some of these take-home thoughts. Initially, consciousness may have been an evolutionary development, critical or at least useful to multicellular organisms.
Consciousness in the Brain by Stanislaus Dehaene, perhaps.
D-E-H-A-E-N-E, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Stanislaus Dehaene.
Consciousness in the Brain.
And in light blue, second thing, consciousness can be shown to infer an evolutionary advantage to organisms.
Hey, what happened? We got a question from online.
Okay,
You want to take another minute for this question? Is that all right?
yeah,
Is it all right with Justin?
yeah.
Because he's here.
Justin
helping.
said it was fine.
Okay, good.
I approached his consciousness and he,
Yeah. Hey, our question is, what happens when a brain runs low on neurotransmitters? Does that interfere with, I'm adding to the question, does that interfere with cognitive processing, do you think?
well, basically, I think the neurotransmitters are produced by amino acids and proteins and things like that. And I would imagine that it would definitely cause an impact if they were withdrawn. I would imagine it would also be something that the body would do everything it could to maintain an adequate supply of those.
Right.
But I'm not enough of a medical awareness to know what really occurs and how,
So-
how you dopamine. I mean, I think it's produced in the body as a result of being in need. If you
Yeah.
need to have certain things go on, your body produces it.
Well, I would say that you use neurotransmitters in the processing not just of your conscious thought, but also many sort of subconscious or preconscious activities of the brain. One of our viewers, Steve Natz, says that Parkinson's disease is a good example of a pathology that arises because a brain is habitually low on dopamine. So there are, and we've heard about, depression, clinical depression, and certain other problems being related to either deficiencies or surpluses in neurotransmitters. So maintaining the chemical balance of the signaling molecules that transmit information between neurons, maintaining that balance is also something the brain has to do,
right,
and can sometimes be challenging,
yeah,
and lead to pathologies.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm imagining, where is the control and how does the body regulate that and flow? How does it detect when it's low?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's down in like the sub-basement of the brain in the thalamus or,
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe somebody who's watching has information about whether or not these neurotransmitters are generated or synthesized chemically by the neurons themselves. Mm-hmm. I think so, but I'm not certain.
Yeah. So consciousness can be shown to infer an evolutionary advantage to organisms. Third, consciousness seems to require attention and is the expression of neural activity above a threshold. The way to make things become conscious is that if you attend to them, either by choice or by your brain realizing that yellow and black means a wasp, and it's the neuron firing is what causes this to occur. You can intentionally try to attend to an object. You decide you're going to watch the football game because they're down on the 3-yard line, and it looks like they really need this touchdown, or something else. But or not only that you attend or decide to attend to something, but sometimes the attention forces its way in, and you don't have control over that as well too.
Yeah, Steve tells us that the neurotransmitters are in fact synthesized by the brain cells.
Wow. So. Thanks, Steve. He's one of my biking buddies, by the way.
Oh, good.
Yeah. In scientific studies, no more than 4 compartments to awareness can be accessed at a time, but each compartment can manage great complexity. They see this along the level of anything that you can attend to ways and experimentally work at.
How does that relate? How does that relate to the 6 to 8 short-term memory slots? Right. When we learn about short-term memory, I remember learning that you could hold a maximum of somewhere between, most people, between 6 and 8 little factoids, like 6 or 8 numbers, etc. How does that relate to the 4?
I think I don't know if the 4 is more current. If they used to think it had to be 6, it has to be at least 6, because I can think of 6 numbers or whatever. But they're basically saying that it has to be chunked. Somehow you have to chunk it in a certain way that you put numbers together. So if you have individual, and they've done in all different studies and across different species too, to the level that they can check with other species. And I'm not even sure that the experimental design to check how much a monkey can remember is pretty interesting to me. But the capacity to do this, and I know I was talking about it, to me it just sounds incomprehensible too, but there's a lot, and it's hard to go into exactly how they've developed that.
But it's in that book.
But basically, there's talk about the capacity of no more than 4 compartmentalized thoughts at a time.
I know when I remember a large number, I break it into bits. So like 344, 237, 984. You know, and so it's 3 chunks instead of whatever that is, 9 chunks.
There was, I think I talked about it last time, the study in which a guy came in twice a week for a year or 2 in Cambridge, and they continually tried to increase his memory, and he got up to being able to know like 80 numbers, which would be sort of, if 10 different people would tell you their phone numbers.
Yeah, but he was chunking, I bet.
Yeah. And how he did it and how he was able to do it, So those are some of the basic thoughts, and I just wanted to come up with a conclusion about the whole concept of consciousness. And I thought, what does realizing that we live in a world that allows for consciousness mean to you? We live in a world that we can see consciousness has a place. And I think it's a miraculous, it's an amazing, it's a awe-inspiring thing, actually. You know, there was 3 billion years of life on Earth without consciousness, as far as we can say. And
or even complex feedback.
Right.
You know, like I was talking about the worm last time.
Right.
You know, worms certainly aren't conscious in any stretch of the definition, but they still sense their environment and know the difference between self and non-self.
Right, right. So to me, this whole concept of consciousness, I think what I came out of this is it's really awe-inspiring. It really brings purpose and hope and joy to our world. Without consciousness, we really have no means to impact our world, right? Or gain insight into what occurs to us. The arrival of consciousness gives purpose and meaning to each of us. And it gives us the potential to impact others and ourselves for the good. So here's to consciousness, I guess.
Here's to consciousness.
And thanks for coming to Science Sunday. We really appreciate it. Scott is on board in 2 weeks.
Yeah, in 2 weeks. You know, I talked about cooking last month in honor of the holiday season. And to continue that idea, I want to talk about something cheerful next time as well. So I'll be talking about cosmic ornaments, some of the most beautiful entities in the cosmos, deep space, you know, nebula and novae and whatnot, and give some examples, not just of the pretty pictures, but some of the science behind it as well.
Nice.
Cosmic ornaments.
And then that'll be the last Science Sunday for 2020, and we're all moving into 2021. I'm not even sure what the first Sunday is in 2021. If it's too close to the holiday, I may push it into the second, but I'll probably just be here doing something on the first Sunday. We haven't talked about that with Justin.
It is the third. First Sunday is the third.
So
we'll figure that out.
Yeah, we'll figure that out and let you know if it's any different. Thanks so much for being here, and had a great time. Enjoy your holiday, and I miss seeing so many of you.
We had really great participation online, I got to say. About 6 different people contributed questions and thoughts. So
yeah, that helps a lot.
you.
That helps a lot.
It's great to know that you're out there.
Yep.
Take care.
Russell and Joan and everyone else. Have a great holiday.